In the last lecture, we talked about the role of air power in World War II, but now let's look at the use of ships and navies. And the striking thing that at the beginning that we notice is that they're very similar in the sense that the war will be decided on the ground, not in the air and not on water, but maybe the ground war will be determined by what happens in the air or on water. And the same concepts reappear, that of supremacy and superiority and then parity. In other words, if you put assets, labor and capital and personnel out at sea, and the other side has a navy or warships that are roughly comparable, then you've wasted your investment. They will fight against each other, but they will not alter the calculus on land. If your ships are more plentiful, or they're better designed, or they're the right ships, or they're better commanded and they're better operated, and you can destroy a great number of the enemy's naval assets, then you achieve naval superiority, which means you can operate against land forces without too much worry of enemy opposition. If you achieve naval supremacy, then you're free to do whatever you want globally on the seas. You can import, export food, you can land troops wherever you want them, you can bombard the shore from naval batteries. So that was the point throughout the history of naval warfare, is to achieve naval supremacy so you can use those assets on water to enhance the war on the ground, which will ultimately be the arbiter of who wins and who loses. When the war broke out in 1939, again, there was the continental power of Italy and Germany and their Eastern European allies, along with the collusion of the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But the United States was 3,000 miles distant in the Atlantic from the theaters in Europe, and even more so in the Pacific from what was going on in Southeast Asia and China. And so the question was, if you're an Axis power and you have declared war on the United States, as happened in December of 1941, how do you reach it? If you don't have four-engine bombers that can bomb the mainland, do you have a mechanism to send a ship over that can either, bombard the shore? Well, at best, that could be 20 miles, but do you have an aircraft carrier that can send bombers that hit Detroit? Again, the answer is no. So in the case of relative naval strength, the war breaks out with some pretty stark realities. Number one, Italy, which has the largest navy after the collapse of the French Navy in the Mediterranean, it has the largest navy in the Mediterranean, does not build a single aircraft carrier. Germany does not build a single aircraft carrier. It's almost analogous to their failure to achieve a four-engine bomber program. In other words, they do not have a mechanism to transmit naval power in a way that would hurt the mainland and the industrial center of their enemies in the United States or Russia, or along Russia's coast, or Great Britain. In contrast, the United States starts the war with 6 aircraft carriers, fleet carriers, that is larger or almost as large as 20,000 tons of displacement and above, and Britain has about 7. And more importantly, there's been a revolutionary change in thinking about naval power before the war starts that will see the United States create orders for more aircraft carriers than all of the navies combined in World War II. And Britain has the same change of thinking, at least on the drawing boards when the war breaks out. Now, the Axis have some advantages. Unlike air power, they haven't quite made the same catastrophic mistakes. They are captives to interwar naval thinking, which puts a great primacy on the battleship. According to the naval theories of the great strategist Alfred Mahan, the idea was that if you could destroy the enemy's warships at sea, then like a wolf among sheep, you could send a dreadnought or a battleship through an enemy convoy and just be unstoppable in your destruction. You could just fire salvo after salvo and nothing could stop you. But the thinking still was, if you want to obtain superiority and therefore export and import or blockade an enemy, you needed better battleships, you needed more of them, and you needed bigger and bigger calibers. This manifested itself, unfortunately, in the Axis idea with, we're going to put a lot of investments. We can, instead of building 20 destroyers, we will build a 45,000-ton Bismarck and its sister ship, the Tirpitz. And you could build 20 destroyers for the amount of money that went into the Bismarck or the Tirpitz. Or in the case of Japan, we can't build as many ships as the United States, but we'll build the Musashi and the Yamato, which are the largest warships in the world at 70,000 tons, and they have, as no other battleship before or since has been able to pull off, they had 18-inch guns. So think of the rationale. The Yamato and the Musashi will sit off 24 miles from an American battleship fleet and bomb it at will, and their 16-inch guns will not be able to hit ours. They'll fall a mile or two short. And when the war broke out, people were even envisioning a super battleship class in all of the belligerent navies that would have guns of 20 inches that could fire maybe 26 miles and beat an 18-inch battery of the opponent. But the answer arises immediately. Well, a battleship has a killing radius of about 20 or so miles. But if you have an asset like an aircraft carrier, and it has 90 fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and they can fly 200 to 500 miles and turn around and land on that carrier, then you can increase your radius of lethality tenfold over a battleship. But because battleships were so majestic, they cut such an awesome spectacle on the sea, and they were so invested in by the naval hierarchies, people didn't catch on when the war broke out to that reality. And so the history of naval power in 1939 to 1945 is simply a question of which navy will wise up and stop investing in battleships and divert that investment to aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers that can attack merchant ships far more efficiently, or they can destroy other battleships in the case of carriers with air power. And the answer was that Italy and Germany lost that war. They did not build an aircraft carrier, as I said, but their effort to build U-boats, as successful in the case of Germany it was too little or too late. When the war broke out, for all the vaunted U-boat reputation in Germany gained from World War I, it still only had about 60 U-boats that were operable in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. And one of the reasons that Hitler so unwisely declared war in the United States on December 11th was his U-boats commanders were telling him, you know, the Americans are really supplying Britain. And when our U-boats sit off the East Coast and they're in the Caribbean, they see these huge convoys. The cities aren't even blacked out. You can see the neon lights of Miami or Newark or New York. And if we could just declare war on them, even though we only have 10 or 12 U-boats, we could get 50 or 60, and we could wipe out the U.S. merchant marine, and that way starve Britain into submission, because we can't touch these boats because we're not officially at war. And that had an undue influence on Hitler and explains the inexplicable, why after Pearl Harbor he declared war on the United States. It looked like for a minute, just as in the case of the early failures of the U.S. Strategic bombing campaign, that the Axis had the edge. So between January of 1942 and June of 1942, there was what they called a second happy time, a period in which U-boats had the technological edge, they had the strategic edge, and the United States really didn't listen to the British about the importance of convoy, or didn't really know how sophisticated the British had become with radar and sonar. In this period, what the Germans called the second happy time, they, for a brief moment, destroyed about 50% of all of the commerce and trade that going into the British Isles. And that was an unsustainable rate. And it looked like the U-boat campaign was going to be successful. But remember, World War II, as we said earlier, is a story of challenge, counter-challenge, response, counter-response. And so when the Allies looked at this unsustainable loss, they came up with a lot of solutions.